She was sold to a debtor by her stepfather, but the Alpha King paid double and claimed her. Lightning streaked the horizon, illuminating the jagged cliffs beyond the city, casting long, trembling shadows over the uneven cobblestones. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, and the murmurs of the gathered crowd carried through the cold wind. Alara stood at the center of the square, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her dress, once fine and delicate, was now dull and threadbare. The rich fabrics of her childhood had been sold, worn, or stolen, and only the barest remnant of her former life remained. Her heart beat with a mixture of fear and fury as she faced the crowd. Every whisper, every glance felt like a blade pressing against her skin. Her stepfather had betrayed her, not just in spirit but in flesh and law. He had sold her to settle his debts, treating her like property, like a piece of coin to be exchanged. She had thought herself prepared, thought she could steel herself against humiliation, but standing here in the cold wind, listening to the coarse laughter and sharp barbs of strangers, her courage wavered. The auctioneer's voice rang out over the square, rough and practiced, carrying over the crowd. "Who will bid for this young lady? Who will claim her for the price of her father's debts?" Alara's stomach twisted. Her stepfather, standing near the edge of the square, did not meet her eyes. He avoided her gaze completely, as if looking would betray some sense of shame he did not possess. The thought filled her with cold fire, a rage that refused to be quenched. She would survive this, she promised herself. She would endure. A low bid rose from the crowd and Alara stiffened. A man with a crooked smile stepped forward, his eyes hungry and calculating. The auctioneer's hammer hovered, ready to seal her fate. But before the gavel could fall, a new presence entered the square. A hush swept through the crowd, sudden and complete. It was not the wind or the storm that silenced them, but the figure that moved with quiet authority at the edge of the square. King Kale. He was a man both feared and revered across the lands. Rumors surrounded him like shadows, a ruler who could command armies and the unseen forces of the world alike. Some said he had been born under a cursed star. Others whispered that he could bend darkness itself to his will. Now his tall frame cut through the mist, his dark eyes scanning the crowd until they settled on her. Alara's breath caught. There was something about him, something both terrifying and magnetic. His presence alone commanded the air. People stepped back instinctively, parting before him as if some invisible boundary of fear and respect followed him. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain, then swallowed. "Your Majesty," he said, voice wavering. You wish to bid." Kale's eyes did not leave Alara. A faint curve of a smile touched his lips, and he raised a hand, smooth and commanding. "I will pay double," he said, his voice low, resonant, like the roll of distant thunder. Gasps spread through the crowd. The man who had been ready to claim her stepped back, suddenly insignificant. Kale's coins were counted quickly and quietly. The hammer fell, not on the crooked man's claim, but on Kale's. The crowd murmured, some in awe, others in fear. Alara felt a strange heat in her chest, a mixture of dread and curiosity. She had expected fear, yet here she felt a pulse of something new, intrigue. Who was this man, and why had he chosen her? Was it chance, desire, or something darker? Kale stepped closer, his cloak brushing the cobblestones. He studied her carefully, and for a moment the world fell away. The storm above seemed to pause in reverence. When he finally spoke, it was not to the auctioneer, but to her. "You belong to me now," he said, almost a whisper, "but that does not mean you are safe." Alara's stomach tightened. She had expected words of ownership or command, but not this. There was a promise of danger in them, and yet an unspoken protection. She did not understand, could not yet, but she knew the road ahead would be uncertain and storm-laden. The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves. Some were fearful, some curious, and a few whispered rumors that Kale had claimed her because of destiny or dark magic. Alara did not care. She felt the first spark of defiance. She would survive this. She would find her place. Kale did not speak again, but he did not need to. Every step he took toward the carriage, every glance he cast in her direction, carried weight. It was not just possession, it was power, and it was complicated. Inside the carriage, the air was heavy with silence. The horses moved swiftly, their hooves striking sparks against the wet cobblestones. Alara sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out the window at the dark city that seemed smaller and less threatening now that Kale was near. Kale's voice broke the quiet, low and almost intimate. "Do not misunderstand. I am not your enemy, but the world outside does not care for your innocence. You will need strength, courage, and cunning to survive." Alara swallowed, her throat dry. "And if I fail?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Kale's eyes softened just slightly, and for a moment he looked like a man who had carried centuries of grief and fury all at once. "Then you will make me answer for my choice," he said, a shadow of a smile brushing his lips. The carriage continued into the night, leaving the auction square behind. The torches flickered and disappeared into the mist. Alara's heart beat in time with the pounding hooves. She did not yet understand the depth of what had just happened, nor the storm that was coming. All she knew was that her life had changed forever. Outside, the wind carried a distant howl, as if the world itself was warning her. And somewhere deep in the shadows, eyes watched their progress, calculating and patient. The kingdom was vast, dark, and full of secrets. She was now a part of it, claimed but not broken. And Kale, the Alpha King, ruler of both shadow and flame, had made his choice. But in that choice, he had also set a chain of events into motion that neither of them could yet control. Alara pressed her forehead to the cold glass of the carriage window, staring at the dark horizon. Fear, curiosity, and a strange flutter of anticipation danced in her chest. She was no longer merely a victim of her stepfather's greed. She was something else now, caught between danger and desire, between fear and the promise of power. And deep inside, she felt the faintest spark of hope. Perhaps she could survive this. Perhaps she could even shape the future. The carriage entered the forest road leading to Kale's fortress, a path lined with trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The mist clung to the branches, and the air smelled of rain and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Alara's pulse quickened. The world outside had changed. The storm above had not passed, and it would not. But perhaps, just perhaps, she would find strength in the shadow of the Alpha King. And perhaps, she thought, he would not be the enemy she feared. But even as she dared to imagine such a thing, the wind whispered through the trees. Not all darkness can be tamed. The carriage rattled on, deeper into the night, and the story of Alara's new life had only just begun. Cliffhanger to end Part I. She did not yet know the dangers ahead, but she could feel them in her bones. The castle waited, full of secrets, power, and shadows. And she, for better or worse, had become part of it. The carriage rattled over the winding road, each stone and rut reminding Alara of how far she had been taken from the life she had known. The mist swirled around them, cold and damp, carrying the distant scent of pine and wet earth. Through the window she glimpsed the jagged cliffs that had loomed over the auction square, now fading into darkness behind her. Kale sat across from her, silent and still. His cloak hung heavily over his shoulders, and his dark eyes reflected the dim torchlight flickering in the carriage. Though he said nothing, Alara could feel the weight of his gaze upon her, sharp and precise, as if he were measuring every movement, every heartbeat, every thought she did not speak aloud. Alara tried to steady herself, pressing her hands together in her lap. She wanted to speak, to ask 100 questions about the castle ahead, about the strange power that radiated from him, but fear held her tongue. The rumors were true. Kale was not an ordinary man. He commanded not only men, but forces that lurked beyond the reach of ordinary knowledge. The carriage jolted as it reached the crest of the hill, and then the gates of the fortress came into view. They were massive, made of dark stone veined with streaks of obsidian, as though the castle itself had been born from shadow. Towers rose like claws into the misty sky, and the wind howled through their spires, carrying with it an almost imperceptible hum of magic. Ilara's breath caught. The fortress was intimidating, alive even, as if it had a consciousness of its own. And at its center, a gate taller than any she had seen before, swung open silently at Kale's approach. Guards lined the path, their armor gleaming faintly in the torchlight, faces impassive and unreadable. "You will address no one here until I give permission," Kale said quietly, his voice calm but carrying a subtle command that made her flinch. "The castle is mine and you are my guest. Learn that now and you may yet keep your dignity." Ilara nodded, the words settling like a cold weight in her chest. She did not understand what kind of man claimed someone so openly in such a public way, nor the rules of a place so far removed from the life she had once known. Yet she knew that defiance could be dangerous. The carriage stopped within the inner courtyard, and Kale stepped out first. The guards followed silently, but it was the castle itself that seemed alive to her senses. The faint echo of steps in empty halls, shadows that moved against the walls, whispers that rose and fell like the wind. "You will stay in your quarters for now," Kale said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Tomorrow you will learn the ways of this place. Until then, observe and understand. The castle watches and you are being watched." He gestured, and a servant appeared silently, holding a candle. Ilara followed, each step echoing unnaturally in the vast halls. The walls were high, made of stone so dark it almost seemed to drink in the torchlight. Tapestries hung, faded but still grand, depicting scenes of battles, kings, and strange creatures, half human, half shadow. Finally, she reached her room, a large chamber with a high ceiling and windows that looked out over the cliffs and forest beyond. The furniture was minimal but elegant, dark wood polished to a soft shine. Yet despite the grandeur, the room felt cold, almost empty, and the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. "You may stay here tonight," Kale said, turning to leave, his presence filling the doorway. "I will visit you in the morning. Remember, the castle tests those within it. One cannot simply exist here. One must endure." He paused, and for a fleeting moment his expression softened. "And you will need strength, Ilara, strength and courage, more than you realize." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet, and the silence of the castle pressed down on her like a living thing. Ilara paced the room, her thoughts racing. She had survived the auction, the betrayal of her stepfather, and now she had entered a place of power and shadow unlike any she had ever imagined. Fear gnawed at her, but beneath it, a small ember of determination flickered. She would not be broken here. She could not be. As the hours passed, she explored her room cautiously, discovering a small writing desk, a wardrobe filled with clothing that was both beautiful and practical, and a balcony that looked out over the cliffs and forest below. The wind blew cold, carrying the scent of rain and distant thunder. For a moment, she felt the smallest stirrings of hope. Perhaps she could make this place her own, or at least find some measure of peace within its walls. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Ilara's heart leapt. She had not expected anyone. "Enter," she called, trying to steady her voice. The door opened, and a young man in the castle's uniform stepped inside. His movements were careful, precise, almost rehearsed. "I am here to assist you, Lady Ilara," he said politely, bowing his head. "My name is Debtor. If you require anything, please ask. You are under the king's protection, but there are rules you must follow." Ilara nodded, grateful for the presence of someone familiar, yet wary of trusting too quickly. "Thank you," she said softly. I do not yet understand the rules of this place." Darien gave a faint, understanding smile. "Few do at first. The castle demands respect. It demands attention, and it watches always, but it also rewards those who learn its ways. You will see soon enough." After Darien left, Ilara stood at the balcony, staring into the forest below. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and the distant howl of a wolf made her shiver. This place was alive, and it was not kind. Yet there was something in the way the castle loomed over the cliffs, in the way the shadows moved across the halls, that both terrified and fascinated her. The next morning, Kale came to her chambers. He entered without knocking, silent as the shadows themselves. Alara's pulse quickened. "You slept?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "Yes," she replied, her hands folded nervously. Kale's eyes studied her carefully. "Good, you must eat, you must be strong. The castle will demand more from you than you expect. And the world outside these walls, it will demand even more." Alara nodded. She wanted to ask questions, to understand why he had claimed her, why he had saved her from that auction, but the words died in her throat. There was something about him that demanded obedience, yes, but also attention. She could not look away. He handed her a cup of tea, its warmth steaming in the cool air of her room. "Drink," he said. "You will need energy. The first lessons begin today." "What lessons?" she asked, hesitant. Kale's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "The lessons of survival, of power, and of understanding. You are no longer just a girl from a small household. You are in my world now. And the world is not kind to those who are unprepared." Alara's stomach twisted. She felt fear and excitement mixing into one strange, burning tension. She wanted to run, to flee back to the streets and the life she knew, but she also knew that she could not. Not now, not ever. She was trapped, and yet she felt a spark of something she had not felt before, possibility. The day passed with strange lessons. Kale led her through the castle, showing her its hidden passages, its traps, its secrets. Every hallway seemed to hold its own story, every shadow its own threat. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words were precise and full of meaning, leaving her thinking long after he had gone. "You must learn to read people," he said at one point, stopping in a gallery filled with portraits of kings and queens long dead. "The world will test your trust. You will be deceived, betrayed, and challenged. You must see the truth beneath the masks." Alara nodded. The weight of his words sank into her like stones, heavy but grounding. She felt herself changing already, her fears sharpening into focus, her resolve hardening. Yet beneath her courage, a quiet doubt lingered. Kale himself was a mystery. He claimed her, yet he seemed distant, haunted. She sensed power in him, yes, but also a vulnerability he hid well. And somewhere deep inside, she felt a flicker of curiosity, even longing. As night fell, the castle's shadows deepened. Torches flickered along the halls, and the wind moaned through the towers. Alara returned to her room, exhausted yet restless. She stood at the balcony, staring out over the cliffs. The storm from the auction square had passed, but its echo remained in her chest, a reminder of how far she had come, and how uncertain her path still was. A sudden sound behind her made her spin. Kale was standing in the doorway, silent as before. His eyes were fixed on her, unreadable, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to vanish. "You must learn," he said softly, "that the castle is not the only thing that watches. There are forces here you do not yet understand, and soon you will see them." Alara swallowed. Her heart pounded in her chest. She did not yet know what he meant, but she felt it in her bones. The castle was alive, Kale was alive, and the night was far from over. And in that moment she realized the truth of her new life. She was no longer simply a girl sold by her stepfather. She was something more, something caught between shadows and power, between fear and fascination, and the castle, and Kale, would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. As she gazed into the dark forest beyond the balcony, a howl echoed again, closer this time. Alara shivered, not from cold, but from the anticipation of the challenges that awaited her. The fortress had begun its lessons, and there was no turning back. The Alpha King had claimed her, yes, but claiming her was only the beginning. And the castle would demand everything. The castle had changed since Alara arrived. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, and the halls felt alive with whispers that spoke to her even when no one was there. The longer she stayed, the more she felt the weight of Kale's world pressing upon her, not just the grandeur of the fortress, but its dangers, its secrets, and the unspoken power that ran like blood through its walls. Each morning, Kale tested her patience and resolve. He walked silently beside her during their lessons, his dark eyes studying her every move. They spoke little, but every word he did say carried meaning. Alara learned quickly that he did not tolerate weakness or deceit. She had thought herself clever before, but the castle required more than cleverness. It demanded courage, perception, and strength of spirit. "You must see the truth beneath the surface," Kale said one afternoon as they walked through the hall of mirrors. The glass reflected their images countless times, shadows multiplying endlessly. "Not all is as it seems, Alara. Some masks hide monsters, others hide grief. Learn to distinguish." Alara nodded. She tried to steady her nerves, to keep her heartbeat even, but every glance at him reminded her of the danger she was in, and yet, something more. She could not deny the way her heart quickened when he looked at her, or the strange pull she felt toward him, even though fear warned her to stay distant. That evening, Kale summoned her to the library. The room was immense, walls lined with shelves so high she had to tilt her head to see the top. Scrolls and books of every size were stacked carefully, and a faint smell of parchment and candle smoke filled the air. Kale moved silently to a table at the center, his presence commanding the space. "You will learn," he said, breaking the quiet, "the history of this kingdom, its magic, and the curse that binds me. You must understand it if you are to survive here." Alara's curiosity was piqued, but fear curled in her stomach. "A curse?" she whispered. Kale's eyes darkened and he leaned against the table, the light catching the sharp angles of his face. "Yes, a curse that is old as the mountains themselves. It haunts me, demands loyalty, and tests all who enter my life. You, Alara, have been brought into this world not by accident but because of it." Alara's hands trembled slightly. She had expected challenges, rules, perhaps even danger, but not this. A curse. The word carried weight, as though her very existence had become part of a story she had not chosen. Kale continued, his voice softer now but no less commanding. "The curse feeds on fear, desire, and hesitation. It can destroy those who are unprepared. That is why I claimed you. You will learn or you will be consumed. The choice is yours, but understand this. I will not allow you to fail without consequence." The weight of his words pressed on her chest, but Alara did not step back. She straightened her spine, meeting his gaze. "I will not fail," she said quietly but firmly. "I will learn." Kale studied her for a long moment as though he were measuring the truth of her words. Then he nodded once. "Good, that is all I ask you for now." Days turned into weeks. Alara learned to navigate the halls, the hidden stairways, the traps, and the rooms of power. She observed the servants, the guards, and even Kale himself, noting the small signs of humanity beneath his formidable presence. He was not cruel without reason. He was precise, calculated, and haunted by the weight of his choices. And beneath it all, she began to sense the loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. Her courage and cleverness did not go unnoticed. Kale's approval was subtle but present, a nod, a rare smile, or a quiet acknowledgement of her insights. And slowly the tension between them shifted. Fear remained, but curiosity, admiration, and an unspoken connection grew, delicate and unsteady. One night, Alara could not sleep. The castle was quiet, but the shadows felt heavy, almost tangible. She moved to the balcony to look at the forest below. The moonlight shimmered over the trees, and the distant howl of wolves carried through the night air. The vastness of the world outside the castle seemed to press in on her, yet she felt a strange comfort in the solitude. Kale appeared silently at her side, as if he had been there all along. Alara did not startle. By now she had grown used to his presence, even when it unsettled her. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I cannot," she admitted. There is too much to think about, too much to understand. Kale's eyes softened slightly. The curse is growing stronger, he said, his voice low. It senses your presence, your courage. It tests me, and now it will test you. Alara shivered, not from fear alone, but from the intensity of his gaze. What does it want? She asked. Kale shook his head. It wants obedience, fear, and despair. It feeds on weakness, but it also recognizes strength. That is why you are here. Together we may survive it. For a long moment they stood in silence. The wind carried the scent of rain, the distant thunder rolling over the cliffs, and the quiet hum of the castle seemed almost alive. Alara felt a strange mix of fear and longing. Kale was dangerous, yet he was her protector. He was enigmatic, yet she felt drawn to him in ways she could not explain. Days later, a visitor arrived, an unexpected shadow from Kale's past, a messenger from a distant kingdom, carrying news that threatened both the castle and the fragile peace within it. Alara watched as Kale's normally unreadable face darkened with concern, and she realized that the danger was not only external. Forces within the kingdom and within Kale himself were stirring. You must be careful, Kale said later, his voice almost a whisper as they walked through the misted gardens. The world outside this castle does not forgive weakness, and neither do I. Alara's pulse quickened. And inside the castle, she asked softly. Kale looked at her, his eyes dark pools of mystery. Inside, you must learn to trust yourself first. Then perhaps you will understand me. She wanted to ask more, to understand him, to unravel the secrets he guarded so fiercely, but the moment passed. The wind blew cold, and the shadows shifted like living things around them. In the following days, Alara proved herself in ways she had never imagined. She saved a servant from an accident, noticed a trap in one of the hallways before it could harm a guard, and even stood her ground when a minor noble tried to insult her in the grand hall. Kale's acknowledgement was subtle, a glance, a brief nod, but it mattered more than words. And in the quiet moments, when the castle was empty and the shadows stretched long, Alara began to see glimpses of the man beneath the king. Kale's hands trembled sometimes when he thought no one was watching. His eyes softened when he believed she was asleep. And when he thought she was not paying attention, he sometimes muttered to himself, lost in memories that were painful and beautiful at once. It was during one such evening, as Alara wandered the library alone, that she discovered a painting hidden behind a heavy curtain. The canvas depicted a woman, beautiful, serene, and sad, standing beside Kale. His expression in the painting was soft, almost tender, unlike the harsh, commanding face she had come to know. Her breath caught. "Who is she?" she whispered to herself. Kale's voice, low and close, answered her from behind. "Someone I lost long ago," he said, without turning to look at her. "Someone I could not save. And because of her, I carry this curse, this responsibility, and now you." Alara felt a pang of understanding. His claim over her was not merely about power or possession. It was also about protection, about survival, about the hope that perhaps together they could face the darkness that neither could endure alone. That night, as the wind howled through the towers, Alara stood at her balcony, staring out over the forest. She thought of the painting, of the shadows, of Kale's words, and she realized that the bond between them was growing, silent, fragile, but undeniable. And yet danger was coming. She had seen the shadow moving in the courtyard, heard whispers carried on the wind, and felt the faintest prickle of magic that was not her own. The curse was awakening, and soon both she and Kale would be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. The castle waited, full of secrets, power, and shadows. And in its silence, Alara understood one truth. Survival here would require more than courage. It would require trust, resilience, and the strength to face both the darkness outside and the darkness within. As she turned from the balcony, the faintest whisper drifted to her through the wind. "Alara, do not falter." She shivered, feeling the weight of the night, the castle, and the man who had claimed her. She was no longer a girl sold at an auction. She was a part of this world now, bound to Kale, bound to the curse, and bound to a fate she could not yet fully see. And the first fires of longing, trust, and reckoning had begun to burn within her. The castle lay in eerie silence, heavier than the night itself. Outside, the wind whipped against the towers, carrying the scent of rain and the distant roar of the cliffs below. Shadows moved like living things across the stone walls, and every torch flickered as though afraid. Alara stood at the edge of the balcony, her cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her heart beat fast, not just from fear, but from anticipation. The shadow that had appeared days before was now closer, more persistent. It was not a physical threat, at least not entirely. It was the curse that Kale had warned her about, a force that sought to test their strength, their courage, and their very souls. Kale approached silently, his dark eyes scanning the night. He looked tired, his shoulders heavy with the burden of the curse he had carried for so long. Yet there was determination in his every movement, a quiet fire that refused to die. "You must be ready," he said, his voice low, carrying over the balcony. "Tonight we face it. The curse will not wait, and it will test both of us. Everything we have learned, everything we are will be required." Alara nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and resolve. She had learned so much in the past weeks, the ways of the castle, the meaning of strength, the subtleties of Kale's power and vulnerability. She understood now that survival depended not only on skill and courage but on trust. Trust in herself and in the man who had claimed her, even as he remained an enigma. The wind carried a faint whisper, almost like a sigh, twisting through the towers and corridors. Shadows coiled along the walls, shifting unnaturally, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Alara felt the prickle of magic against her skin, sensing the unseen eyes that watched her. She shivered but did not move back. Kale extended his hand. "We go together. Fear will only feed it. Stand with me." Alara took a deep breath, then placed her hand in his. The warmth of his touch anchored her, a reminder that she was not alone. Together, they descended the spiral staircase to the heart of the castle, where the curse awaited. The central hall was vast and hollow, with ceilings so high that the torchlight barely reached the shadows above. At its center, a black mist writhed like living smoke, coiling and twisting with a movement that seemed both intelligent and malevolent. This was the curse in its full form, a presence that radiated cold power and ancient malice. Alara's pulse quickened, but she stood firm beside Kale. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword, though the weapon itself was not for the ordinary world. Its power was tied to the curse, a tether that balanced the magic around him. "You must focus," Kale whispered. "Do not let it see your fear. Let it feel your courage. Only then can it be defeated." Alara nodded. She inhaled deeply, centering herself. The lessons, the trials, the weeks of fear and discovery had prepared her for this. She would not falter. The black mist surged forward, forming shapes, faces, claws, and shadowy figures that seemed to echo the fears of the heart. They reached for Kale, seeking to engulf them both. Kale's voice rang out, low and commanding. "Stand firm. It cannot break those who face it together." Alara felt a strange connection to the mist, as though it could sense the growing bond between them. It lashed out, trying to separate them, to exploit their doubts and fears. Shadows wrapped around her, cold and suffocating, whispering words meant to wound and confuse. But Alara held fast. She gripped Kale's hand, meeting his gaze. She did not see a king, a ruler, or even a man. She saw a partner, someone who carried a pain and burden far greater than her own, and in that recognition she found strength. "Together," she said softly, yet with power. "We face it together." Kale nodded, and the mist recoiled slightly, sensing their resolve. He stepped forward, raising his hand, and the shadows twisted back, pulling against the force of his will. The air crackled with energy, a tension so strong it seemed to vibrate in Alara's chest. For a moment everything was chaos. The shadows surged, the hall shook, and the distant towers groaned under the weight of the storm. Yet in the center of it all, Ilara and Kale stood firm, connected, their courage radiating outward. The mist hissed and writhed, trying to find cracks in their resolve, but none appeared. "You are stronger than I imagined," Kale murmured almost to himself. "Stronger than anyone I have known." Ilara's breath caught. "And you?" she asked. "Are you strong enough to let me stand beside you?" He met her gaze, his eyes dark, intense, yet soft. For the first time there was no command, no distance, only recognition, only trust. "I am," he said simply, "but you must not falter, not for me, not for yourself." The curse feeds on hesitation. The shadows twisted violently, forming shapes of those Kale had lost, the woman in the painting, the enemies he had faced, the mistakes he had carried for years. Each figure lunged, a mirror of memory and pain. Ilara's heart ached for him, for the loneliness, for the weight of centuries he seemed to bear alone. "Face it," she whispered, more to him than to the shadows. "Face it with me." Kale's hand tightened around hers and he stepped forward. The mist recoiled at their unity. The curse tried to lash out again, but their courage was a shield, their trust a weapon. Slowly, the shadows began to weaken. The forms that had haunted Kale dissolved into mist, leaving only the swirling black center. The air grew lighter, the pressure of ancient magic lessened, and a faint golden light began to seep through the cracks in the hall. Ilara and Kale stood together, breathing heavily, their hands still joined. They had survived the first trial, not alone but together. Kale lowered his hand from the hilt of his sword, looking at her with something unreadable, gratitude, admiration, perhaps even something more. "You have no idea what this means," he said softly. "You have changed everything." Ilara felt a warmth in her chest she had not known before. "We changed it together," she replied. For a moment, silence filled the hall, heavy with relief and exhaustion. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the room, a soft whisper echoed. "The trial is not over, but you have taken the first step." Ilara shivered, but this time not from fear. The presence of the curse was still there, lurking, but the first victory had been theirs. She felt the fire of determination burn brighter within her. They could face this together. Kale turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the faint light. "You have strength," he said, almost in awe, "and courage. I underestimated you." Ilara smiled faintly. "And I underestimated you," she admitted. "I thought you were only a king, only a ruler, but you are more than that." He took a step closer, and for a moment the space between them seemed to dissolve. Not a king and a subject, not master and ward, but two souls standing together against the darkness. "You are mine," he said quietly, "not because I claimed you, but because you chose to stand with me." Ilara's breath caught. She had been afraid, hesitant, unsure of where she belonged. Now, in the quiet after the storm, she understood. She had chosen him, not out of fear or necessity, but because she saw the man beneath the shadow, the heart beneath the crown. The night outside softened, the wind carrying a gentle whisper of dawn. The curse had been tested and they had passed. But Kale knew, as did Ilara, that this was only the beginning. The kingdom, the castle, and the powers that ruled it would continue to challenge them. Yet, for the first time, Ilara felt hope. She had found her place, her strength, and the truth that courage and trust could overcome even the deepest shadows. And Kale was no longer alone. They walked together from the hall, the first faint light of morning touching the towers. The castle seemed less ominous now, its shadows less threatening, as if it acknowledged their victory. Ilara looked up at him, and for the first time she saw a future beyond fear. A future shaped not by betrayal or darkness, but by courage, trust, and perhaps even love. Kale's hand brushed hers, a simple gesture yet full of meaning. "The world outside will not be easy," he said, "but together we will face it." Ilara nodded, her heart steady. "Together," she echoed. The curse was not gone, the kingdom was still dangerous, and the shadows still lingered. But in that moment they had faced the impossible and endured. The trials had forged a bond stronger than fear, a connection deeper than power, and a spark of hope that could light even the darkest night. And as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Alara knew one truth that could never be taken from her. She was no longer a girl sold at an auction. She was a survivor, a partner, and a force to be reckoned with. And beside her stood the Alpha King, no longer just a ruler, but a man who had learned to trust, to hope, and to stand together with her against the shadows.